Hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in a 4-part series about imperialism. And in today's video, we're going to focus on Africa as a place that Europe would look to for resources and a marketplace for goods in a process that we understand as imperialism. So what we'll look here as is what was it like in Africa before the Europeans gobbled it up through their imperialistic motives, and just talk a little bit about those changes and the shift from before to after, I guess you could say. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so Africa before imperialism. Now, part of what I want you to see on the slide up here is the picture, and you can see that you've got the continent of Africa sitting in front of you in the year 1880. And if you look at the shaded areas, the main thing I want you to understand about the shaded areas that are basically along the edges, the coastal areas of Africa, is those were the areas of European presence and influence by the year 1880. So as late as 1880, most of the continent of Africa, over 90% of the continent of Africa was, I guess you could argue, independent of outside influence. Now, that was not because Europeans had just recently discovered that Africa had existed. Europeans had known that Africa was to their south for centuries, and in fact had been in contact with Africa in specific and intentional ways for hundreds of years up to this point. But despite that, Europeans didn't have very much control of the African continent itself. That again, their main areas of influence were coastal areas. Their contacts were mostly related to as trade contacts, Europeans and Africans exchanging goods that each desired with one another, and that was about it. Now, this was not because Europe didn't necessarily have greater ambitions than that throughout the time that they were in contact with Africa. Europeans were certainly well aware that there were a lot of resources and a lot of things that they would like to have greater access to, but there were some pretty big obstacles that would finally start going away as we get to the later 1800s. And just to speak to a few of those major obstacles, one, powerful African armies. One of the things that was a reality that Europeans were going to face and had faced was that if they wanted to have greater control over different parts of Africa, they were very likely going to have to fight for that. And for quite a long time, they didn't have enough advantages that they could bring to a fight to actually stand much of a chance of succeeding in a battle over territory, for example. So militarily, it took until the late 1800s for Europeans to be equipped in such a way that they would have a realistic chance of fighting their way into and seizing territory. Another challenge for Europeans was just the ability to get to the interior. The military aspect was certainly a part of that, but just having their own tools to make it into the interior of Africa. One of the best ways to potentially do this would be to sail up a river system, but not until steamships started to be built and were usable did Europeans have the technology to be able to sail upstream and actually start getting into the interior spaces for more exploration. So that's something that would come around much later for them. And then another reality was the trading that did exist throughout Africa was to a high degree controlled by the different African groups that were involved with trade. So it wasn't something that was just sitting there waiting for Europeans to take over. It was well established, strongly run networks that were definitely going to take time and a certain kind of effort and a certain kind of persuasive ability for Europeans to seize control of what was already well established in Africa. So one thing to note, the fact that imperialism doesn't rear its head in Africa until the late 1800s wasn't necessarily because Europeans didn't think about it until then. There were just a lot of obstacles that were too difficult to overcome. Now, the region where a lot of momentum builds for Europeans beginning to take the steps necessary to establish more control in Africa was the Congo region. Now, when thinking of the Congo region, basically think of Central Africa, and where it really began to a large degree was out of efforts by people who actually were against the slave trade, wanted to promote Christianity, working their way into places like Africa and trying to get into the interior parts of this continent and have a positive influence on people. There's a lot of intrigue and a lot of interest in places like America and in Europe to learn more about this continent, this place that Europeans and Americans didn't really know a lot about. And it would ultimately come from that an American reporter named Henry Stanley would actually travel to Africa, and as it turns out, he would end up making deals with local leaders, local chiefs, on behalf of the King of Belgium, a guy named Leopold II, to gain control of the region. Now, one of the reasons where imperialism and kind of how it's played out at times can be very sinister is with this example of how King Leopold II of Belgium managed to assume control of essentially Central Africa. And that was when Henry Stanley helped broker these deals to get leaders in that region to basically hand over some authority to Leopold II, was explaining that this would be a step towards stopping the slave trade. And the slave trade was a devastating thing for communities throughout Africa. Some of their strongest, best people were simply being stolen, basically being taken and sold away. And that was hurtful to those communities. So anything that could stop the slave trade was often very welcome. Now, if you want to get really technical, it's probably technically accurate that after these deals were made and King Leopold II came in and took control, the slave trade in that region did stop. The problem was he needed labor to work the rubber trees, to collect sap, to make rubber. Labor intensive, and he simply exploited the labor of the people who were living in that region. So they maybe weren't sold into slavery, as had been true before for some people, but they were exploited and worked in terrible, terrible conditions, conditions that would be very consistent with what you might expect out of terrible slave conditions right there in the Congo region. Now, eventually, okay, time reference, this was 1882 when this got established. Now, in time, Belgium would take over the colony. That would happen by 1908, but the damage was done. Once it was seen that Leopold II had a foothold in a part of Africa, other European countries wanted to get involved as well. They didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to have a piece of Africa. So really from this point moving forward, you see over the course of just a couple of decades, the continent of Africa go from being primarily independent of outside rule to virtually completely controlled by outside countries. The picture on the screen here shows Africa into the early 1900s, and it's not necessarily important to see who controlled each area, but if you just see the different colors that are noted up there, those represent different European countries controlling an area. Like the large green area, that was controlled by France. The red area, where you see more towards the top and then the very bottom, that was controlled by England. Now, the only two places that didn't end up getting gobbled up by one European country or another was Liberia, which is on the kind of the west coast, and then on this map it's labeled as Abyssinia. That's where Ethiopia is at today. But otherwise, European countries were in control of Africa, and often not to the benefit of the people that were already living there. And so with that, Africa had been taken over. And I think we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. In the next video, what you'll see are some of the attitudes that help drive imperialism, as well as technological advances that made taking over Africa possible. So I hope you'll join me for that. I hope today's video was helpful and informative. Thanks for watching.